The operating room lights blazed white and sterile above the small body on the table, while somewhere beyond those walls, in rooms the child had never seen, his parents wrestled with fear in separate silences. The surgeon's hands moved with precision over the 3-year-old's abdomen, fighting against time and infection that had already poisoned the boy's small frame. No one in that room, not the nurses counting breaths, not the anesthesiologist monitoring the fragile heartbeat, not the doctor himself, could have known that the child's consciousness had already slipped away to somewhere impossibly distant, while machines beeped their mechanical rhythms and gloved hands worked to save his life. Colton Burpo was no longer confined to the boundaries of that sterile room, no longer tethered to the failing body beneath the surgeon's blade. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that defied every law of medicine and physics, somewhere that would change not only his life but the lives of millions who would one day hear his story. Imperial, Nebraska, was the kind of town where everyone knew your name and your story before you finished telling it yourself. 2,000 people called it home, spread across the farmland where Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska met in a patchwork of green circles irrigated by center pivots that turned slowly under the endless sky. Todd Burpo served as pastor of Crossroads Wesleyan Church, a man who knew every family in his congregation by heart, who installed garage doors to supplement his modest pastor's salary, and who volunteered as a firefighter because that's what you did in a small town where neighbors were family. His wife Sonia taught children with the kind of patience that came from genuine love, managing the chaos of ministry life and motherhood with grace that never faltered even when tested. Their daughter Cassie was 6, bright-eyed, and protective of her little brother, while Colton, born on May 19, 1999, was the kind of child who lit up every room he entered, curious and fearless and full of that particular joy that only the very young possess. The Burpos were ordinary people living an ordinary life of faith, never imagining that their family would soon become the center of a story that would captivate the entire world. The year leading up to that march had been brutal, a relentless test that left the family financially drained and emotionally exhausted. Todd had shattered his leg sliding into base during a softball game, endured 2 surgeries, suffered through kidney stones, and faced a cancer scare that turned out to be hyperplasia. Their bank account made sucking sounds with every statement, medical bills piling up like snowdrifts against their modest income. They had planned a trip to Greeley, Colorado, partly for Todd's district board meeting, and partly just to breathe, to let their children run through the butterfly pavilion and forget about hospitals for one blessed day. February 27, 2003, started with Colton complaining of stomach pain, but the doctor dismissed it as flu, the same diagnosis they'd given other kids that week. By morning, he seemed better, so they went ahead with their plans, driving through the flat Nebraska landscape toward Colorado, toward what they thought would be a brief respite from the year's relentless hardships. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. On March 1st, they watched Colton delight in the butterflies, even convinced him to hold Rosie the tarantula for the promise of a sticker, his initial fear giving way to wonder. But that evening, still in Colorado, everything changed. Colton began vomiting uncontrollably, his small body racked with pain that no child should have to endure. They rushed back toward Imperial, but Sonia's instincts, she and Todd had both suffered appendicitis, told her this was something far more serious than flu. On March 3rd, the doctor in Imperial examined Colton but dismissed the idea of appendicitis, a mistake that cost them precious time as the boy's appendix ruptured and poison flooded his small abdomen. By March 5th, when they finally got him to Great Plains Regional Medical Center in North Platte, the damage was catastrophic. The infections so advanced that the medical staff stopped offering encouragement to the terrified parents. One nurse would later tell Todd, "I don't believe in God, but I want you to know this is a miracle," words she would speak only after Colton survived what should have killed him. In the chapel, Todd Burpo fell to his knees and screamed at God, his pastoral composure shattered by the very real possibility that his son was dying in an operating room down the hall. He begged, demanded, bargained with the divine. His prayers, raw and desperate in a way they had never been before, stripped of all theological language, and reduced to the most primal cry of a father facing the unthinkable. In another room, Sonia paced and called everyone she could think of, mobilizing a prayer chain that stretched across Imperial and beyond. Her voice steady, even as her heart shattered. Neither parent knew that their son could see them from somewhere impossible, that his consciousness had somehow separated from his body and witnessed these moments of their deepest anguish. Back in Imperial, the congregation gathered in spontaneous prayer meetings, storm clouds gathering outside as they lifted up the name of a little boy fighting for his life in a hospital 17 days' worth of fear away. The surgery stretched on, the complications mounting: a bowel obstruction that required a second procedure, infections that wouldn't respond to antibiotics, a constipation so severe that doctors suggested transferring him to Denver. But then a freak snowstorm hit North Platte, trapping them all in place, and in that enforced stillness, something shifted. The prayers either reached their mark or coincidence bent impossibly in their favor, and Colton's condition began to improve. By March 17th, the doctors stood amazed, their medical training offering no explanation for the sudden reversal in a case they had privately written off as terminal. The boy who should have died was sitting up, asking for food, his color returning, and his eyes clear in a way that defied every grim prognosis they had delivered. On March 19th, after 17 days that felt like 17 years, the Burpos finally carried their son home to Imperial, grateful and exhausted, and forever changed by how close they had come to losing him. But the miracle of his survival was only the beginning. Only the prologue to a story that would unfold in the months ahead in ways none of them could have anticipated. 4 months passed before Colton began to reveal what had happened to him in that operating room. 4 months of apparent normalcy before the first inexplicable words fell from his lips on July 3, 2003. They were driving to South Dakota to visit relatives, passing by the hospital in North Platte, when Sonia asked if he remembered being there. Colton's response stopped them cold. "That's where the angels sang to me." He had never mentioned angels before, had never spoken of anything unusual about his hospital stay, and his parents pulled into an Arby's parking lot, suddenly desperate to understand what their 4-year-old son was trying to tell them. The details came slowly, measured out in the halting vocabulary of early childhood, but they accumulated into something that neither Todd nor Sonia could explain away or rationalize. Colton told them he had left his body during the surgery, that he had floated up and could see the doctor operating on him from above, could see his father in the chapel yelling at God, could see his mother on the phone in the waiting room even though he had been unconscious, and could not possibly have witnessed any of these things. He described sitting on Jesus' lap while angels sang to calm his fear, spoke of heaven in colors more vivid than anything on earth, told of meeting people he had never known existed. When Todd showed him pictures of his grandfather, Pop, who had died in a car crash in 1976-23, years before Colton was born, the boy shook his head and said that wasn't what Pop looked like. Pop was young in heaven, he explained, because everyone there was young and whole and perfect. A theological insight that no child should possess, but that lined up perfectly with biblical descriptions Colton had never been taught. Then came the revelation that shattered any remaining doubt. Colton spoke of meeting his sister in heaven, a little girl who had run to him and hugged him and was so excited that someone from her family had finally come. Sonia and Todd exchanged stricken glances, because they had never told Colton about the miscarriage on June 20, 1998, had never spoken to him about the baby they lost when Sonia was 2 months pregnant, had judged the topic beyond a 4-year-old's capacity to understand. The little girl in heaven had been one of the first to greet him, Colton said, her joy radiating as she wrapped her small arms around her brother, who had not yet been born when she departed the world. She told him who she was, explained their relationship with a certainty that transcended the confusion of early childhood, and Colton accepted her presence with the same matter-of-fact wonder with which he accepted everything else about his heavenly visitation. He described Jesus with specificity that unnerved his pastor-father eyes like the sea, blue and sparkling hair that looked like it had been dipped in light, markers on his hands and feet where the nails had pierced him. Details that matched biblical descriptions but came from a child who had never studied crucifixion theology. He spoke of the throne room, of streets that looked like gold but didn't hurt your bare feet, of a rainbow horse that Jesus rode, of the archangel Michael with his special sword, of Mary kneeling before God's throne in worship. The information kept coming, in fragments spread across months and years, each detail adding to a picture that was either the most elaborate fantasy a child had ever constructed, or the most compelling evidence of an afterlife that skeptics had ever been forced to confront. Todd, trained in theology and pastoral ministry, tried to reason it away, tried to find natural explanations for how his son could know these things, but every avenue of logic led to dead ends. In Imperial, word spread the way it always did in small towns, through conversations at the post office, through whispers at church, through the inevitable gossip that followed any unusual event. Funerals became impromptu testimonies, as mourners pulled Todd aside to ask about what his son had said, desperate for hope that their own departed loved ones might be waiting in that place of light and music and eternal youth. The story gained momentum, taking on a life of its own, until strangers began showing up at the Burpo home, claiming God had sent them to tell Todd he needed to write a book. Todd resisted at first, uncomfortable with the attention, wary of exploiting his son's experience, protective of their privacy in a way that only small-town people who value anonymity could understand. But the pressure mounted from all sides, from his congregation, from fellow pastors, from people who had been comforted by Colton's story and believed it needed to reach beyond Imperial's borders. Finally, Todd made what he called a Gideon prayer, telling God that if this book was truly meant to be, the publishing world would have to come find him in Imperial, Nebraska, because he had no idea how to write a book or navigate that industry. The phone call came from literary agent Joel Needler, and Todd heard God's voice in one ear while the agent spoke in the other, reminding him of promises made and purposes larger than his own comfort. The book Heaven is for Real was published in 2010, 7 years after Colton's surgery. Co-written with Lynn Vincent, who helped shape the Burpo's testimony into a narrative that would eventually sell more than 8 million copies. What started as a family's private experience became a cultural phenomenon, sparking conversations about faith and the afterlife in living rooms and churches and skeptical circles around the globe. Critics emerged immediately, some questioning the theology, others dismissing it as childhood fantasy, still others accusing the family of exploitation and fraud. The controversy only intensified when the book was adapted into a major motion picture in 2014, with Greg Kinnear playing Todd and young Connor Coram portraying Colton. The film grossing over $100 million and thrusting the Burpos even further into a spotlight they had never sought. Through it all, Colton stood by his story, even as other children who claimed similar experiences later recanted. Alex Malaki's admission that his book, The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven, was fiction cast doubt on the entire genre of heaven tourism literature. But Colton, now a teenager, calmly affirmed that his experience remained true, that he had no reason to lie then, and no reason to change his testimony now. His consistency across 2 decades, from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, would become one of the most compelling aspects of the story for believers, and one of the most frustrating elements for skeptics who could find no smoking gun to discredit him. Life continued for the Burp, but never quite returned to normal. Because how could it after something that profound had intersected with their ordinary existence? Todd continued pastoring, though now with invitations to speak at churches across the country, where people packed pews to hear about his son's journey beyond the veil. Sonia remained the steady anchor of the family, managing the chaos of sudden fame with the same grace she had managed the chaos of medical crises and financial hardship. Cassie grew up as the sibling whose own story often got overshadowed, though she handled it with remarkable maturity and her own quiet faith. And Colton, the boy who had been the center of it, all grew into a young man who learned to navigate the strange territory of being both ordinary and extraordinary, known by millions for something that happened when he was barely old enough to form permanent memories. He wrestled with temptation like any other young person, struggled with sin and doubt and the pressure of being seen as somehow more spiritual because of a single experience. Came to understand that going to heaven and returning did not make him angelic or exempt from the daily work of faith. In high school, he told interviewers, God began challenging him to develop a relationship that went deeper than just that one miraculous event, calling him to a faith grounded, not in a childhood memory, but in daily choice and commitment. The same 55 classmates he graduated with were the same 55 he had started kindergarten with, and they knew him too well to treat him like anything other than just Colton, which was exactly what he needed to stay grounded. The years passed, and the boy became a man. Colton Burpo at 25 was a husband, a father, an electrician, and a worship pastor in Colorado, living a life that honored both the extraordinary experience of his childhood and the ordinary demands of adult faith. He married in 2022, and in the spring of 2025, he and his wife welcomed their first child, a moment that gave him profound new insight into what his parents must have felt during those 17 days of medical crisis. The story he had told as a 4-year-old continued to bring comfort to people who had lost children, who faced terminal diagnoses, who needed to believe that the separation of death was not final, and that love transcended the boundary between this world and the next. His testimony had become part of something larger than himself, a thread woven into the broader tapestry of faith testimonies that stretched back millennia, adding one more voice to the chorus, claiming that what we see is not all there is, that consciousness persists beyond clinical death, that heaven is not metaphor but destination, whether viewed as evidence, inspiration, or cautionary tale, depending on one's perspective. The story refused to fade, refused to be easily dismissed or neatly explained, remaining stubbornly present in the cultural conversation about mortality and meaning. Colton himself seemed remarkably unimpressed by his own fame, more interested in being a good father and faithful worshipper than in being the boy who went to heaven, though he continued to share his story when asked, because he believed it offered hope to those who desperately needed it. In the end, what made Colton Burpo's story endure was not just the dramatic details or the impossible-to-explain revelations, but something more elemental, the deep human hunger to know that death is not the end, that love continues beyond the grave, that the people we lose are not lost, but waiting. Every parent who had suffered a miscarriage found solace in Colton's insistence that his sister was joyful in heaven, that she had hugged him and was excited rather than lonely or abandoned. Every person who had watched a loved one die wondered if perhaps they too had been greeted by angels singing, had sat on the lap of divine love, had been made young and whole and perfect in some dimension adjacent to our own. The skeptics could point to brain chemistry and childhood suggestions, to the power of cultural conditioning and the unreliability of memory, to the suspicious timing of revelations that came months after the surgery when plenty of family conversations could have unconsciously planted seeds, but the believers could point back to the specificity of details Colton should not have known, to the consistency of his testimony across 2 decades, to the medical miracle of his survival from a burst appendix that had filled his abdomen with poison, to the thousands of people whose faith had been strengthened or rekindled by hearing that heaven might actually be as real and wonderful as Scripture promised. Both sides had their arguments, their evidence, their explanations, and neither could definitively prove the other wrong, and perhaps that uncertainty was itself part of the story's power, inviting each person to examine what they believed and why. 20-2 years after that March day in 2003. Colton Burpo's story remains a testament to the enduring human need for hope in the face of mortality, for meaning in the midst of suffering, for evidence that the material world we can see and touch is not the full extent of reality. Whether his experience was literal journey or elaborate dream, divine revelation or neurological event, matters less perhaps than what it has meant to the millions who drew comfort from it: the grieving parents, the dying patients, the doubting believers, the spiritually curious. Faith, at its core, has always required a leap beyond what can be empirically proven, a willingness to trust in realities that resist scientific measurement, And Colton's story invited people to take that leap or reinforced the leap they had already taken. The little boy who survived the and returned with reports of angels and Jesus and a sister he never knew existed became a living reminder that mystery still exists in an age that prides itself on having explained everything. That wonder can still break through the mundane rhythms of ordinary life in extraordinary ways. And in Imperial, Nebraska, where it all began in that town of 2,000 souls spread across the farmland, where 3 states meet, the story remains part of local lore. A reminder that sometimes the most profound moments happen not in great cities or famous places, but in small towns where everyone knows your name, and miracles can unfold in the space between one breath and the next. This account draws from documented events that captured worldwide attention through the best-selling book Heaven is for Real, written by Todd Burpo with Lynn Vincent and published by Thomas Nelson in 2010, which sold more than 8 million copies and inspired a major motion picture released by Sony Pictures in 2014. The medical crisis that nearly claimed Colton Burpo's life in March 2003 at Great Plains Regional Medical Center in North Platte, Nebraska. The subsequent revelations about his near-death experience and his family's decision to share their story have been verified through multiple sources, including interviews with CBN News, The Christian Post, Lancaster Online, and Pure Flix, as well as comprehensive fact-checking by History vs. Hollywood. Colton's consistent testimony over more than 2 decades, from childhood through his current work as a worship pastor, electrician, husband, and father at age 20, continues to inspire conversations about faith, the afterlife, and the nature of consciousness, a true American story of hope that transcends denominational boundaries and speaks to the universal human longing to know what lies beyond death's door.